It's very odd to come from a country that is full of revenge, a history of oppression by the Western countries, especially United States and Britain. And as our friends mentioned, not talking for a long time, 34 years, not talking with the enemy, with the opposite side. And so we are in a new, I can say new atmosphere that is very promising to have a new president believes in talking with the enemy. Still, the title of and label of enemy is there, but we have started to talk. And so this is too far from forgiving the enemy, forgiving the perpetrators. And so I have come to learn more about how to educate our youth, our university students, to forgive their enemies. About 100 oppression ended to an Islamic revolution in Iran. And so we have a religious system, religious government that in a negative sense is the government of revenge. In a positive sense, they call themselves the system of justice. And so the justice is always challenging with forgiveness, that the good excuse for the people avoid forgiving is doing justice. So it's good excuse for my government that always talking about revenge. And for them, the only virtue is the virtue of justice. And we were hoping that having a religious system can help us to learn and shift from the paradigm of justice or paradigm of revenge to paradigm of forgiveness by the help of verses and scriptures that Baisab mentioned in the beginning, that all religions talk and call for forgiveness. But unfortunately, it didn't work in my country. And no talk about forgiveness, just talk about revenge. So I'm very needful and to learn more how can educate forgiveness in a country like Iran, in a country that always blame the other side as perpetrator and culpable of oppression and themselves as victims. I myself is a victim of the war, 8-year war between Iran and Iraq. My brother was killed in that war and myself was injured. And 1/3 of my health is gone because of the chemical weapon used by Saddam Hussein in that war. So many bad memories of the time we lived during this Islamic revolution and religious system. But I hope that the new government, President Rouhani, can open new window and avenue for teaching, encouraging, and calling my people to practice forgiveness.
The word forgiveness itself is derived from the Anglo-Saxon root for, meaning away, and gifen, meaning to give. Hence, to give away, which corresponds to aphesis in the Greek New Testament. In forgiveness, negative feelings such as anger and resentment at being wronged are given up and relinquished. Forgiveness presupposes that a wrong has been done or an injury has been endured without adequate cause, and that the injured party is prepared to overlook the offence. By wrong in this context is meant something that is sufficiently serious for it not to be simply overlooked. Forgiveness is to treat the offender as if he or she has never committed the wrong. Thus, forgiveness is essentially a performative utterance. Forgiveness is shown as the offender is treated as if no offence had originally been committed and no hurt originally inflicted. An offence destroys a relationship, and forgiveness restores it. The theological meaning of forgiveness may be helpful here, for when God forgives, any deserved punishment is set aside. Forgiveness dispenses with punishment. Strictly speaking, the demands of justice are not met, at least by the offender. Theologically, we may want to say that God bears the offence. The guilty before God are set free. Their offences are not held against them. They are reconciled to God. Implicit in this interpretation is the fact that God is a personal being who enters into relationships with his human creations. To be forgiven by God is to initiate or renew a personal relationship of love and communion. Criminal acts are not personal matters. One should not forgive the criminal who has wronged you. One should seek justice. Though the issue of forgiveness may arise if there has been a previously existing personal relationship between the victim and the offender, and such personal reconciliation may run parallel or subsequent to the judicial process. Hence, forgiveness does not apply to criminal offences, relationships between states, or between social or institutional bodies. Or if forgiveness does apply, it does in some metaphorical way, as opposed to the literal way in which it applies within the context of personal relationships. A logically prior question to including forgiveness as a component of any program of moral education is to ask whether the practice of forgiveness is moral. Should pupils, or anyone else for that matter, be encouraged to forgive? There are objections to forgiveness. Why overlook the hurt and pain that others inflict? Why should the offended be called upon to forgive their offenders? Sometimes it is claimed that forgiveness allows one to put away feelings of anger and resentment, as it does. Yet this is a pragmatic or utilitarian and even self-serving reason for forgiveness. You forgive to benefit yourself psychologically. Perhaps you want to continue as before, with as little fuss or inconvenience as possible. You may even be too frightened to show your disgust and anger. A more convincing reason, and one that is fully moral, is that forgiveness should be granted only when there is acknowledgement that a wrong has been done, for which one is now contrite or sorry. The old-fashioned way of expressing this is to refer to the need for repentance. Forgiveness is conditional in personal relationships on repentance. An admission of guilt by the offender acknowledges that a wrong has been committed and that there is now regret for the original offensive act. Forgiveness and the interpretation of forgiveness are part of a wider moral and intellectual framework, and the practice of forgiveness makes sense and is justified by this wider framework. For the religions, this wider framework is also, of course, religious as well as moral and intellectual. Forgiveness of others is grounded in divine forgiveness, and divine forgiveness in turn relates to other beliefs and doctrines. I use the example of Christianity, with which I am familiar. Doctrines to do with mercy, pardon, repentance, atonement, the death of Christ, and so on. Typically within the religions, forgiveness is not simply permissible, but obligatory. Forgive those who trespass against you. Like forgiveness, other religious dispositions are part of a wider religious whole that involves beliefs, practices, emotions, and volitional commitments. There are two things that are relevant to education, particularly religious education, that follow from this. First, pupils need to be acquainted with the doxastic character of religions. That's the belief aspect of religions. And with the connected nature of religious beliefs and the way in which they mutually support and relate to each other. One of the chief weaknesses of much modern teaching in religious education is that particular religious phenomena are abstracted from their respective frameworks of belief and practice and presented under common cross-religious themes such as festivals, leaders, and pilgrimages, and the impression is given that they are freestanding and independent of the wider whole. Certainly, positive dispositions should be presented to pupils as accessible and achievable by all. Yet there is also a place for acquainting pupils with the place and role of moral dispositions within the religious framework of different religions. Second, and finally, religions are more than belief systems. Religions encompass literature, myths, legends, traditions, ancient and contemporary biographies, stories, and encounters. These rich sources provide educators with resources to illustrate, challenge, justify, and encourage pupils to acquire positive dispositions and to live respectfully and responsibly in the world.
I think we constantly have to reference our pontifications with real experience and remember that what we say has a significant impact on how people understand and interpret their experience, and what we say needs to show respect to the pain that people suffer. Now, I mean, that might seem very patronizing, but I think it's a terribly important starting point. It seems to me, from any standpoint, that revenge and bitterness are never better alternatives. There may be exceptions to that sweeping statement, but almost always revenge and bitterness are never better. There's an Irish-American scholar, he's a lawyer and a philosopher whom I greatly respect, Geoffrey Murphy, J.G. Murphy, who has coined the phrase, 2 cheers for revenge. And I think what Murphy's getting at, he's saying, is we talk up forgiveness too much. We're too quick and we're too keen to forgive. And I think he's right. And there is a place for not forgiving quickly and forgiving in a morally and philosophically responsible way. Now, to be provocative, I'm going to give you 3 reasons why I think forgiveness doesn't work. And 3 reasons why, in educating for forgiveness that I really believe in, we have to be aware of the difficulties of the subject. And they've been alluded to, but I'm just going to spell them out. One is, where is justice? I respectfully disagree with you, Rasoul, that forgiveness and justice are impossible to marry. I think it is possible to live with the dynamic tension of forgiveness and justice. But certainly with my children, virtually the first thing they learned to say was after the word mine and no, was the phrase, it's not fair, where fair is a diphthong. It's not fair. It seems to me that justice and the longing for justice is is constitutive of our identity. The second thing is what Hannah Arendt calls the predicament of irreversibility. And I'm using it slightly differently or at least the conclusion I'm drawing is different. But basically, an act once done is irreversible. And if I forgive you for wronging me, I'm a different person as a result of the act that's been done. And you are a different person, probably repentant or sorry. You are a different person. You cannot put the clock back. So you can never forgive, as it were, in the original situation. It's now the changed victim who is forgiving the changed wrongdoer. I also want to say that In educating for forgiveness, we have to be very careful that we don't educate people into thinking the wrong they've suffered doesn't matter. I mean, this is terribly difficult, isn't it? You can't put all the bits together neatly. Of course I don't want my children to be vengeful and bitter, but neither do I want them to be worms that people tread on. I want to make 4 suggestions as to how we can educate people to have a sophisticated and subtle and elastic view of forgiveness. First of all, forgiveness is a process. It's never, to my mind, a once and once only act. It's like peeling off the layers of an onion. I also think that forgiveness has a medley of different outcomes. How can I put it? I'll just read what I've put. I suggest that some of those outcomes, there are others, have to do with the wrongdoer making a moral response to the wrong having been done. There has to be some regret, some remorse, repentance, maybe seeking a restored relationship, maybe putting things right when possible. The third thing is, I think this is now obvious from what I've said, I don't think forgiveness is one thing. I think we need to talk about forgivenesses. In other words, forgiveness being lots of different things depending on the situation, the gravity of the wrong, the nature of the person wronged, the response of the person wronged. I don't think we have something necessarily identifiable, definable, and recognizable in forgiveness. Forgiveness is not like a mathematical formula or an equation. It is a blend and balance of responses to particular situations by particular people. And then lastly, and this follows, I think we should talk about forgiveness having texture. And I've adapted some terms somebody else coined. I've adapted the terms thin forgiveness and thick forgiveness. Thick forgiveness, it seems to me, is forgiveness in its most richly textured form. You punch me on the nose, you're deeply, deeply sorry and remorseful. You'd had too much to drink, you'd had an argument, you were disinhibited, you're very sorry, I reminded you of your uncle who was abusive to you as a child, lots of reasons you're deeply remorseful, and apologise to me, and I say, of course I understand, I forgive you, let's put this behind us, let's continue our constructive working relationship in our department, and let's live happily ever after. That is thick forgiveness. Now, in between that, at one end of the spectrum, there are, at the other, sorry, I haven't expressed it very well, but there are a host of other reactions you can have that are forgiving to a greater or lesser extent, which are in varying degrees thick or thin forgiveness. So what happens if your Aunt Sally, who wronged you when you were a child, is now dead? Now the philosophers will tell us, and rightly so, you can't forgive dead people. But actually, you can. So I suspect taking these 4 approaches to forgiveness is satisfying philosophically and makes good sense pragmatically and pastorally.
Thank you so much.
My special interest is in the cultural diversity out of which a number of world religions emerged. My specialism is in the 1st century. I think that during that period, the cultural interaction was maybe similarly diverse as today, and understanding between these people in this diverse culture was probably as complicated or complex as today, at least by analogy. So I think in this context, in this multi-faith, multicultural, multilinguistic context, the presupposition of interaction was not mutual understanding, but that understanding does not inherently happen when people communicate. Quite often in my field, it is presupposed that understanding happens because people speak the same language, Greek, or we all speak English. Thank goodness that we have a language in which we all can communicate. But even so, we use this language in very diverse ways and infused by our life experiences, our cultural experiences, and the words we use resonate differently within us because of our life experiences and because of our contextual faith, cultural, etc. experiences. So what I'm trying to say is the presupposition of understanding is, I think, the awareness that we might not understand what we mutually try to communicate. So the first issue would be to stop and say, did we really hear what our interlocutor was trying to say? And when we talk to each other, I think this is very important, even if we try to understand forgiveness. It has been mentioned, well, is there such a universal concept which means the same everywhere, or is it not rather the contextuality we need to try to understand in order to pass on to our children what we mean? So I think this is one of the purposes of what we do here, trying to communicate with each other. What do we mean by it before we can actually educate